Captain Brant, fully equipped with his magical grapple gun and absurd aerial moveset, is finally up for his first banner ever, and it's safe to say he's launching with everything he needs to excel in the latter half of version 2.1, with a brilliantly stylish playstyle and potential as both a DPS, healer, and a buffer. As a fusion, basic attack damage focused character that heavily buffs resonant skill damage, many players looking to leverage characters like Changli, Chisha, or Carlotta will gain a ton of mileage out of his kit, and due to his hybrid playstyle, he has an incredible amount of potential as future releases are added to the roster. With that, welcome to our full scope, comprehensive guide on Brant, the newest addition to Wuthering Waves, and I'm here to break down everything when it comes to how he works, what his best equipment will be, and the steps you need to take across his team building and rotations to make the most out of his insane burst damage and buffing potential. As always, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that like and subscribe button. Brant, with his baseline kit, centers around building up his Forte circuit to deliver an incredibly powerful nuke via an anchor smashing down on the heads of his enemies. And naturally, that Forte circuit is where this breakdown will begin. Brant's Forte circuit has several components. The first is passive and centers around a flat increase to his attack that scales off his energy recharge percentage over 150. He gains 12 points of attack with a cap of 1560 or exactly 280 ER. Reaching this threshold requires a fair amount of investment in Brant's Echoes and weapon, but isn't necessary for his kit to work. You'll just be missing that extra bit of damage and healing. The next component is his Forte Enhanced Resonance skill, returned from the ashes. Whenever Brant's Forte circuit is filled, he can cast an Enhanced Resonance skill with a long animation time that deals a massive amount of damage, considered basic attack, and also shield the team. This shields all members of his team, but that shield isn't transferable on swap, meaning that each team member swapped onto, even after taking damage, will have a fresh shield across its duration. The third component is, well, how the Forte circuit actually builds up. When Brant uses his normal attacks, intro skill, or his baseline resonance skill, he'll generate Bravo and additionally heal his team based off his ER for every 1/4 of his circuit he builds up. Building up this circuit as fast as possible is one of the key elements of his kit, so let's break down all the ways he can generate Bravo. The first method is through his normal attacks, and it's safe to say that Brant has the most complex normal attack in the game, due to the fact he has full movesets both on the ground and in the air. His ground basic attack is a simple 4-hit attack chain, and his heavy attack is a single hit attack with a surprisingly large amount of scaling. His basic attack chain can combo into a unique heavy attack called Rhapsodic Rift after the 2nd or 4th stage by holding down the attack button. In the air, however, Brant's attacks have far more complexity. He's got a 4-stage attack chain and the ability to flip in the air after an attack by pressing the attack button, or continuously attack an enemy by holding down the attack button while in the 1st or 2nd stage of his air attack chain. Holding down the button is one of the fastest ways to generate his Bravo. Brant will flip backwards after each of these held attacks, and after each flip, he can press the attack button again to advance to the next chain. A flip will automatically happen after Brant's 3rd stage air attack, and after each flip, he resets his mid-air dodge attempt, meaning that he can perform quite a few air dodges across his rotation. While in the 1st stage of his air attack, Brant can sometimes fail to reach his target. In this case, he'll do a slash forward. If Brant reaches his target, but his attack fails to land in either his 1st or 2nd stage, he'll suspend in the air for a brief moment before dropping to the ground. After failing either of these two attacks, you can follow up with a plunge by normal attacking or air dodge and then attack to begin a new combo. Properly learning Brant's inputs, especially during his first 2 stages of his air attacks, is key to generating the most Bravo possible in the shortest amount of time. Brant can also generate Bravo with his dodge counters, which can only be performed on the ground. When attacking after a perfect dodge in the air, Brant will simply continue his mid-air attack chain at the next stage. The second method of generating Brant's Bravo is through his baseline resonance skill. While on the ground, Brant's resonance skill simply deals damage and lifts himself into the air. While in the air, however, his resonance skill simply performs a plunge attack. His third method of generating his circuit is simple, and that's his intro. This ability causes Brant to enter the battlefield in the air and also advances his next air attack chain to stage 2 until he lands or switches out. His resonance liberation is the final part of his kit that interacts with this Forte circuit, and it's a big one. Casting the ability deals damage in a wide area, heals his team based off his ER, and also applies the Aflame state, which buffs his Bravo generation by 100% when using normal attacks or resonance skills, while additionally increasing his attack scaling from ER from 12 points per ER above 150 to 20, bringing the total possible buff to 2600 attack at 280% ER. This Aflame state ends whenever he casts his enhanced resonance skill, Returned from Ashes. When factoring in all of Brant's abilities, attack chains, and interactions with each other, he has an acrobatic playstyle that focuses on entering the field via his intro skill, casting his resonance liberation, and then then chaining together air combos on an enemy via his regular and held attacks to generate his forte circuit as fast as possible, healing his team while also giving him access to his incredibly powerful enhanced skill, Return from Ashes. In an optimal rotation, Brant will fully maximize his concerto gauge after using this attack, giving him access to his very powerful outro skill that buffs the incoming Resonator's fusion damage by 20% and skill damage by 25%, lasting 14 seconds or until character swap. Many of his attacks deal impressive damage but have long cast times, making him a great candidate for quick swaps to another damage dealer to provide him temporary invulnerability while he completes an attack. By using these quick swap windows on moves like his stage 2 held air attack, his stage 3 air attack, or Return from Ashes, you can maximize your team's damage output with the help of a second character. With the buff from a Flame's effect on Bravo Generation, you can build up a full forte circuit from a single air combo and trigger his very powerful enhanced skill within seconds after beginning his rotation. When it comes to Brant's inherent skills, his first buffs his forte circuit's team-wide healing by 20%. Nothing too crazy here. His second, on the other hand, grants him interruption resistance while performing mid-air attacks and an impressive 15% fusion damage. Brant's a character with a huge amount of potential given his hybrid moveset and ability to inflict massive amounts of burst damage in a very short amount of time, given you can land his air combos. Given his short field time, he performs the best as a sub DPS hybrid that can buff another unit on his team, preferably a character like Changli, but he also has some use cases with other members of the roster. When it comes to actually building Brant, starting off with his skills, you'll want to prioritize his forte circuit as it's the primary source of his burst damage, healing, and shielding. You'll then max his basic attacks as they're 100% necessary to build up his Bravo. Then you'll max out his liberation as it'll increase his overall rotation's damage and his team-wide healing. His resonance skill is very low priority as it'll never be used in his optimal rotations, and you can keep his intro skill at level 6 or lower since its scaling isn't really worth the weekly boss mats. Next up, let's talk about Brant's weapons. His selection of weapons is a little complicated and will vary depending on which Echo set he runs. Here's what the calculations are looking like using Emerald of Genesis, the standard 5-star sword with Molten Rift as a baseline. Credits to Pridewin. Let's explain these results, starting off with his signature, Unflickering Valor. This weapon will be used with Tide-Breaking Courage, which requires 250% ER to activate its set effect. It also comes equipped with a whopping 77% ER, a very low base attack, 8% crit, and a stacking, low-duration basic attack buff across his rotation. Given Brant's very fast rotation time and reliance on basic attack damage, he'll get amazing use out of this weapon to stack up his Forte Circuit's passive and also ramp up his damage. It's easily his number one choice by a landslide. The next best option is, surprisingly enough, Red Spring, Camellia Signature. This weapon's high base attack, crit rate, and stacking basic attack buff make it a decent alternative if paired with Molten Rift and as much ER subs as you can on his Echo substats. Emerald of Genesis is the third choice, coming with a built-in ER bonus that'll help stack up his Forte Circuit's conversion passive, but it's difficult to use its weapon effect across Brant's rotations as using a resonance skill in the air will cause Brant to perform a plunge attack. This weapon is especially powerful with additional synchronization ranks as the passive ER will increase with each dupe. The other main viable options for Brant will consist of 4 stars, but they're not very good. Overture seems like it would be Brant's second best option with its built-in ER stat, but its lack of damaging weapon effect, even in combination with the Tide-Breaking Courage set, causes it to fall far behind the competition. Looming Gloss, the BP weapon, is the last viable choice, as it gives a stacking increase to basic attack damage through its effect. However, its low overall stats make it pale in comparison to other options. It's also best used with the Molten Rift set. I don't recommend any other weapons when it comes to gearing Brant, and it's quite clear he's unfortunately one of the most signature-reliant characters in the game. Now, it's time to move on to his Echoes, and Brant has 2 options to choose from. If you're gearing him with his signature or Overture, you'll want to run Tide-Breaking Courage for its massive bonuses upon reaching 250% ER, and the Dragon of Dirge's incredible passive effect of 12% fusion and basic attack damage. On all other weapons, you'll run Molten Rift with a regular Inferno Rider that buffs fusion and basic attack damage. For his Echo main stats, you have 2 real options. If you have Brant's signature, his optimal damage with great substats will come from a crit rate 4 cost, 1 ER 3 cost, and a fusion damage 3 cost with 2 attack 1 costs. On other weapons or Molten Rift, you'll run 2 ER 3 costs instead, keeping all other main stats the same. For substats, on the other hand, there will be identical requirements across both sets, prioritizing as much ER as possible with a cap of 280%, critical rate, damage, basic attack damage, and attack. Basic attack damage rolls are incredibly powerful on Brant given his passive conversion of ER that gives him flat attack, but attack percentage rolls will work fine as well, especially if you're using a set like Molten Rift and a high base attack weapon like Emerald Emerald of Genesis. Other damage rolls are pretty ineffective across his rotations, so don't go searching for them. It can be very difficult to optimize Brant's echoes with ER and double crit on every piece, so prioritize reaching 250% ER on tie-breaking courage, with any extra being a bonus, or simply as much ER as possible while balancing crit ratios on the Molten Rift set for decent performance without bankrupting your tuners in tubes. Make sure to run a critical damage forecast as well if you're using a crit rate weapon like Emerald of Genesis or Red Spring. The last area of investment when it comes to Brant involves your wallet or a lot of saved Astrite. His sequence nodes. Big thanks to Pridewin for calculating the damage increase per node. Brant's first node is absolutely incredible. It adds a crowd control effect to his enhanced resonance skill that dissipates when he leaves the field, and also grants a stacking 20% damage bonus whenever he uses an intro skill or any of the flips in his mid-air attacks, with a cap of 60% or 3 stacks. His second node is also incredibly strong, increasing the crit rate of his mid-air attacks and enhanced skill by 30%. It's highly recommended to run a crit damage forecast instead of crit rate if you're acquiring this node. It also adds a bonus to his outro skill, making resonant skill casts by its recipients hit targets for 440% of Brant's attack as basic attack damage up to 2 times. His third is another fantastic boost, increasing the damage multiplier of his enhanced resonance skill by a whopping 42%. His fourth node is unfortunately far more sustained focused, buffing the shield on his Forte circuit by 20% while adding an additional heal scaling with his ER on his enhanced resonance skill. His fifth node is a little boring, granting him a 15% basic attack damage buff whenever he uses one. His sixth and final node is the big one, increasing the damage multiplier of his mid-air attacks by 30% and causing his enhanced resonance skill to detonate a second time, dealing 30% of its original damage, which builds off of his S3 as basic attack damage. Now that we've covered Brant's build, let's get into some of his teams and optimal rotations. And my oh my, he has a lot of options based off the current 2.1 roster. With a buffing outro skill that focuses on fusion damage and resonant skill damage, Brant's main partners will include another sub DPS hybrid like Changli, or a resonant skill focused damage dealer like Carlotta. Brant, as a healer, can also function in compositions that don't feature a support like Baija, Shorekeeper, or Verena to great effect, instead substituting them for another sub DPS like Sanhua to diversify his potential lineups. One of Brant's simplest teams to use involves very little quick swapping across the team's rotation, instead focusing on leveraging outro skill buffs to inflict damage with extended field time on each character. This lineup is Brant, Changli, and Sanhua. In this team, you'll start off on Sanhua, cast your resonant skill in Liberation, and then hold down your attack button until the tick mark on her Forte circuit moves onto the active area. You'll then release the attack and immediately swap to Changli to use her resonant skill, and then a true sight attack on the ground or in the air. Following this, you'll swap back to Sanhua to fill up her concerto, activate her echo skill, and then intro onto Brant to give him Sanhua's massive buff to basic attack damage. Brant will then use his Liberation, hold down his basic attack until he completes his spin attack and flips, and then follow up with more mid-air attacks until his Forte circuit is completely filled. He'll then cast Return from Ashes, topping off his concerto gauge before using an intro skill onto Changli. Changli will then use an air true sight attack, a resonance skill, and another true sight attack, and then her second resonance skill into a ground true strike attack to fully maximize her inflamement stacks. She'll then use her enhanced heavy attack, then her resonance liberation, and then her enhanced heavy attack again before swapping onto Sanhua to begin a new rotation. This team requires only one swap across this rotation at the very start, and it's one of the easiest ones in the game. The damage may not be as high as some raw quickswap teams, but it's much easier to play and will still clear content, and gives a lot of Changli players the opportunity to pilot her in a far less intensive team comp. You'll also have the option of playing a character like Rosia instead of Sanhua in this lineup, and with Rosia's boost of 200 flat attack on her Resonance Liberation, she actually synergizes surprisingly well with his poor attack percentage scaling with his signature. On the other hand, you can easily play Brant in Quickswap with Changli. Just make sure you're instead using a character like Verena or Shorekeeper instead of Sanhua. In this composition, you'll start off your rotation on Changli, using a Resonance skill and True Sight attack before swapping to a support to fill up their concerto. Once filled, you'll intro skill onto Brant and then hold down your basic attack to begin his vertical spinning attack. During this attack, you'll swap back onto Changli in the air, activating her Resonance skill before swapping back to Brant to continue his air attacks. You'll You'll then tap his basic attack until he has a full Forte circuit, and then cast his enhanced resonance skill. During this animation, you'll swap back to Changli, activate her true sight attack, and then swap back to Brant after his Forte circuit lands. At this point, Brant will have a full concerto gauge, so you can immediately swap back to Changli with an outro skill. Changli will then intro in, use her true sight, cast her resonance skill, and then use her ground true sight. You'll then immediately cast her enhanced heavy attack, her resonance liberation, and then her second enhanced heavy attack before swapping onto another character. There's definitely potential to swap off of Changli during her cast animations of these abilities, but I personally don't recommend it, as that will cause her to lose the massive amplification for Brant's outro skill. For my initial findings, these are the best and most reliable swap windows I've found during Brant's rotation, but don't hesitate to experiment and see if you can weave in more of Changli's resonance skills and true sight attacks across Brant's rotation. A third way to use Brant is easily his simplest, and that's as a basic sub DPS that buffs a hypercarry like Carlotta. If he's serving this role, it might be a good idea to instead put him on Moonlit Clouds to complete his buffing ability. In these teams' rotations, you'll build up Concerto on a support, intro skill onto Brant, complete his rotation, and then intro skill onto a character like Carlotta to perform her full rotation. This kind of team comp is very simple to play, but doesn't fully maximize the potential of his outro skill buff. Still, it's another team comp that makes use of his buffing potential. Other Brant teammates that I haven't covered but are still viable with him include Chisha, who has a buff to basic attack damage on her S6 and benefits from his outro skill, and Encore, who buffs fusion damage on her S4 and also benefits from his outro buff. In these teams, you'll typically use his simplest rotation to buff these two characters like a hypercarry, rather than the swap-intensive playstyles you might be using with Changli. Brant's last possible team composition is with him as the hypercarry, with a support and a sub DPS like Sanhua to buff his damage. You'll run a simple setup on your support in Sanhua, swapping to Sanhua partway through your support's Concerto buildup to use her skill, Liberation, and Detonation heavy attack before swapping back to your support to max out their Concerto. Then you'll swap back to Sanhua, top her Concerto off, and intro onto Brant to complete his rotation. After his first return from Ashes, you'll remain on field, cast his resonance skill on the ground, and repeat more air combos until you fill up his Forte circuit again and cast a second return from Ashes. Afterwards, you'll outro onto a support or Sanhua. Brant can do an impressive amount of damage at an optimized build, but unfortunately, it can be very tricky to fit in two enhanced skills within one rotation, and his outro skill won't be a huge benefit to the team. This can, however, work out very well if your Brant is S2, since he'll have some extra damage coming in from his outro skill. Now that we've covered Brant's team's rotations, it's time to talk about Brant's, and thankfully, as long as you can get the timing right on his air combos, they're actually pretty easy to pick up. When Brant enters via an intro skill, you'll begin your next mid-air attack at stage 2 as long as he doesn't touch the ground. You'll then cast his Resonance Liberation and then hold down the attack button to perform his stage 2 attack and follow-up spin that generates a huge amount of Bravo. You'll then continue his mid-air attacks, weaving in dodges if necessary until his Forte circuit is completely filled, and then cast his enhanced resonance skill to nuke the enemy and completely fill his Concerto gauge. After his gauge is full, you'll simply activate the Dragon of Dirge's Echo skill and then swap to a different character. If you're using Molten Rift, make sure to weave in the Inferno Rider's Echo skill before Brant begins his rotation. You'll also want to use a regular resonance skill prior to his intro so you can activate the set's effect too. If you ever miss the enemy with your stage 1 or stage 2 attack, you'll end up performing a plunge if you keep mashing your attack button. So if you want to continue your air attacks, simply perform a dodge in the air instead to reset your entire attack chain and start back at stage 1. Brant is heavily reliant on the Aflame buff from his Resonance Liberation to have the fastest and optimal rotations, so keep in mind that your Forte circuit buildup will take a lot longer if you don't have his Liberation active. Since this is an early guide, keep in mind that there might be many new ways to quick swap or optimize Brant's rotation further, so be on the lookout for follow-up content on Brant if you're interested in some new tech. At the end of the day, Brant is one of the most versatile and unique characters in the game, blending together burst damage, buffing, and healing all into one aerial package, with his main drawbacks being his extremely limited viable weapons and hard to optimize echo substats. There are very few characters you can directly compare to him, given that he's a jack of all trades that can functionally do more than everybody else on the roster. He's relatively easy to pilot once you get the hang of his aerial mechanics, and has many potential team comps due to his very fast rotation time, but has the potential to quick swap across his rotation given how his flips work across his mid-air attacks. While he's an incredibly fun character to play, he truly isn't necessary across every team comp, comp, as the role he plays can be substituted with plenty of other options, like a Changli Yao for Changli, or a Jeja or Taochi for Carlotta, or a Sanhua for Encore. But he opens up many potential team comps for the existing roster, especially those that aren't running a pure sustain. He's very far from a must pull, but he's also one of the greatest pulls you can make if fun is your primary objective. As always, if you enjoyed this content, please hit that like and subscribe button. Peace out.